Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Before I begin, I wanted to quickly acknowledge the impact of the floods that we're currently dealing with and thank first responders from across the city, the county, and other jurisdictions for all the hard work that they're doing to keep us safe every day. As I pledged from day one, my office is working to enhance the standard of transparency within the city of Houston, to increase the public's understanding around how tax dollars are being spent and how decisions in City Hall affect all of us. I've made the same commitment to policymakers. Whenever possible, we will put useful information at the fingertips of the mayor and city council, translating complex financial and operational data into a format that you can understand more easily and that will aid you in making important decisions. In keeping with that commitment, today's briefing is designed to share information that I believe is useful for members of council and for the public. Many of us still have questions about the details of the proposed firefighter agreement, and my office has received a number of inquiries about the financial implications of the proposal. This morning's briefings spell out the issues with the Houston firefighter pay in recent years, and it also discusses the financial implications of both making our firefighters whole for years of undercompensation and getting the pay scale going forward on par with peer cities across Texas through a new collective bargaining agreement. While we recognize the behind-the-scenes nature of the negotiations up to this point, our aim today is to clarify the information that's available to us, both for council members and their staff, as well as for concerned Houstonians across our city. With that, I'm going to get started. I see that we have a number of members of council and their staffs present, as well as mayor staff. If you all have questions throughout the presentation, the point of this is to make this information clear to you, so raise your hand, stop me, interject, and we'll clarify that information. For members of the press, if you would refrain until the end of the presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. And Councilmember Thomas, I didn't see you there. Good to see you. Thanks for being here this morning. All right, with that, let's dive in. Before we go into this analysis, I just kind of want to lay out the steps that got us here. Back in mid-March, the mayor and Local 341 announced that a proposed settlement had come together. That settlement would end long-standing litigation related to back pay and would also establish a collective bargaining agreement through fiscal year 2029. That back pay settlement would cover fiscal years 2018 to 2024, and the settlement amount would be for $650 million in addition to additional fees like legal and specials. Going forward, the collective bargaining agreement calls for a 10% raise in fiscal year 2025 and raises of up to 6% annually over the next 4 years through fiscal year 2029. Again, we have yet to see the terms of the settlement, but we have been briefed on these high-level financial figures. Many stakeholders, both on council and from across the community, have reached out to our office saying, hey, tell me what you know about this. Is this a fair settlement? And we've been clear every step of the way that questions around fairness are up to decision makers. That's the mayor, that's city council, that's Local 341. And that's the decision that you all will have to make as to if you believe that this settlement is fair. Here's a position of our office. Number one, transparency is paramount. Big decisions like this, we need to be sharing information with policymakers as well as the public, and so that's the primary purpose of why we're here today. Number two, our firefighters have to be paid competitively. If we're going to attract talent and retain talent going forward, we need to make sure that HFD and the city as a whole is a great place to work, and part of that includes fair compensation and competitive compensation for our teams. And then finally, as with all decisions that are of this magnitude, that have this significant a price tag attached to them, we have to be clear. The mayor and city council have to understand for yourselves and then explain to the public how we're going to pay for things like this. And so again, this presentation seeks to put these numbers in perspective for your benefit, council, and of course for members of the public. So this will be in two parts. First, we'll look at the proposed CBA, which is forward-looking from 2025 to fiscal year 2029, and then we'll look at the proposed back pay settlement. So some context before we look into any of this. We have to understand where firefighter compensation has been since the beginning of the impasse in fiscal year 2027. And so when you look at this chart, and we try to keep the graphics similar over the course of the presentation, that red line that you see with the shading underneath it, that represents HFD's actual starting salary over this time period. And by starting salary, we mean a year one firefighter post probation. That blue line that you see above it, that's the average salary of our peer cities on a per hour basis. You might ask, why are we using a per hour basis? As many of you know, our firefighters here in the city of Houston, according to their collective bargaining agreement and state law, work 46.7 hours per week. Those numbers are different in our peer cities, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Austin, and Dallas. The average is 54.75. I believe the range is from 51 up to 56, if I'm not mistaken. And so when we talk about being competitive, we want to make sure that we're looking at an apples to apples comparison, because gross pay isn't apples to apples in some scenarios, right? And just to over clarify this, if a certain job pays $100,000 but you work 20 hours a week, and another job pays $100,000 but you work 40 hours a week, the one that works 20 hours a week, people would think you got paid more there, right? And so again, we put this on a per hour basis to make it as truly comparable as possible. But what you can see from this graph is that on a per hour basis, we have been lower than our peers since the beginning of this impasse, and I imagine well before that. From FY 2017 through 2021, our firefighters did not receive any raises whatsoever. Starting in 2022, they received 6% each year. So that's 6% in 22, again in 23, and again in 24. As you can see from the chart here, those raises don't get us close to that average. In fact, I believe that we still remain roughly 10% lower than our peers on a per hour basis today, okay? And so as we look forward, the goal is to make us more competitive. As we look backwards, the decision that you have to make is, what's a fair number to compensate them for not receiving these raises over time. So this chart has us looking forward. Again, we're looking at the collective bargaining agreement that's proposed from 25 to 29. As you can see, the red line of the starting salary for firefighters remains at the beginning lower than its peers. And it starts to catch up slowly to where in 2026, it's roughly equal. Let me tell you what the numbers represent here. For firefighters, HFD firefighters, what we see here is a 10% raise in 2025, and then 6% raises every single year from 26 to 29. What you see for our peers is the raise from 2024 to 2025 that's implied in their collective bargaining agreements. And then we don't have collective bargaining agreements for them going beyond that. So what we looked at was the 5-year average of raises over that time period in our competitive set. The average is about 3%. And so what you'll see in that dotted blue line from 2025 out to 2029 is an assumption of a 3% raise for those years for our peer set. So what you see again, even with the 10% raise in 2025, we still remain just a bit short of our peer per hour average for starting salary. Going into 2026, we get to about even. And then as you progress in further years, with us receiving a 6% raise and our peers receiving a 3% raise, we get to be above average salary by the end of that period, and indeed beginning in 2027. I'll pause there. Any questions about collective bargaining agreement and the going forward raises? Councilmember Pollard.
So on this particular slide, where would the starting salary, the actual value amount be for 2029?
Sure. So that is a great question. I know that in 2024, we're looking at about 51.8. I'm sad to say I don't have the 2029 figure right in front of me. As you can see from the chart, it's in the ballpark of about $72,000. Obviously, we can get you that specific number here. But what you're starting at that 51.8 figure, which is the actual today, and you raise that 10% and then raise that 6% 4 more times. Councilmember Castillo?
Yes, on this chart, the contract has 2 tracks for raises, but depending on revenues in these years out here. So you're projecting the full amount of the salary increase?
Yep.
Okay. Would it be possible to see this information with the lower amount?
Yeah, very happy to show you the 4433 figure. The reason why we use the 6% figure is this. We've made clear in our public statements, and I believe that the mayor and his team have made clear in their public statements, that the only way out of this issue, and I don't mean the firefighters issue, I mean the structural deficit to begin with, which this deal will tack onto and make even more substantial. The only way out of that is through revenue options. From what we know today, the trigger for the firefighters getting the 6% raise is support of those revenue options that we believe are nearly 100% likely. And so that's why we use 6% as the assumption. But as we'll state in a couple of slides here, we are more than happy to run a number of different scenarios and certainly happy to run that for you. Just using back of the envelope math, again, if our peers are getting 3% a year and we're getting 3 or 4% a year, I think we'd be about on par with them using those assumptions. But we'll get the exact to you, no problem. Anything else on collective bargaining agreement before we move forward to the back pay settlement? All right, let's move forward. So we bring this same chart up in front of you here, and I want to talk to you really step by step about the methodology that we used to analyze the potential settlement value. So again, the position of what is fair is up to you all. I'm sure that each and every one of you have in your head some assumption of what is fair. I imagine the mayor and his team have some assumption, and I imagine that the firefighters have their own. We're not taking any sort of judgment in this. We run a number of different scenarios, and we simply do the math to tell you that if you were to put the firefighters in a financial place in the disputed years from 2018 to 2024, this would be the value of the settlement. So how do we do that? So step one is to create the scenarios themselves. So if you look at the slide here, what we used was a 4% annual raise scenario. Again, we're not opining on right or wrong. This is just an example for you all. So in a 4% scenario, you look at those green dots that are there on the slide, and that shows you the raises and the reflective year one firefighter salary that would have come from those had we given HFD raises of 4% a year over this entire time period, right? So that's step one, is just create this pay scenario. Step two is then to calculate the gap between what firefighters would have made in that scenario and what they made in real life, right? Comparing the proposed to the actual, if you will, and measuring that distance. Now, what this shows on this chart is a first-year firefighter, right? So it's looking at the gap between, high 40s and, low 40s, or looking at the gap between mid-50s and low 50s for a salary. That's for illustrative purposes on this slide. What's in our model is looking at millions and tens of million dollars a year, that if we gave firefighters a 4% raise, this is how much it would cost us in addition to what they were paid in actuality. Does that make sense? And then step three is to add interest onto that, right? As we get further and further along in time, those dollars that firefighters would have been paid in 2018 or 19 or 20, those are worth more today. And so we used a 5% interest rate. Now, where we are today is roughly in that ballpark. We know that for many of these years we were in a lower interest rate environment, but we use 5% as our interest rate. Again, we could run additional scenarios at 3%, at 7%, whatever you'd like to see, we can share with you. So step three is, after understanding those gaps, between the various years, it's tacking on interest to the values of what it would have cost to pay firefighters that amount in that year. And then finally, you add all those up together, and that would be the settlement value, quote unquote, for that scenario. Does that make sense? So again, being illustrative here, if we were to do that math on this 4% scenario, what that would show, if you can go back, is if you gave firefighters a 4% raise every single year, starting in 2018 all the way through 2024, what they would have is a starting salary, first year, non-probationary, of around $57,300. In that scenario, it would have cost the city over that time frame an additional $260 million to cover those raises. And when you add interest, that gets you up to roughly $300 million. As you'll see throughout this, you'll see round figures that we use. Again, that's to make this simple. Our model has exact figures, but the ranges are important. So what does $300 million mean for the firefighters? Well, you know, for roughly 4,000, a little bit more than 4,000 firefighters, that's $65,000 to $75,000 per firefighter. And if you look at that on an annual basis, that would be somewhere between $9,000 and $11,000 per firefighter per disputed year in this scenario. And so I apologize for over-explaining this, but again, the point is to make it clear so that you understand the methodology that we're using for these scenarios. And I think I got head nods from the folks in the room. So let's move forward. So what are the scenarios that we looked at? I want to reiterate and I'm going to continue to reiterate, there are infinite number of scenarios that you could run for this. As we mentioned in our notes, our thoughts are around competitive salary for HFD firefighters. And so the scenarios that we ran emulate competition, competitive salary for HFD firefighters and some of their peers. And so what are those scenarios? The first one is, had we made HFD firefighters pay equal to the average of other major city fire departments on a per hour basis the entire time frame. So going back to that slide that you saw before, you had the red line and the blue line. If we had given them that blue line the whole time, that's scenario one. Scenario two is related to that, but it's a little bit different. Instead of giving them a big jump to put them on par with their peers in that first year, it gives them steady raises over time so that by FY 2024, the year that we're in right now, they would have reached that average pay across the state. Scenario three compares us to ourselves. So this looks at the percentage raises that HPD police officers received over this time frame. And it says, what if we had given HFD firefighters that exact same raise from 2018 to 2024? And similarly, scenario four relates to other city employees. Other city employees, of course, as you know, are represented by the Hope Union, Local 123, and the raise that they negotiated and received over the course of fiscal year 18 to 2024 is what's reflected in scenario four. And then finally, for illustrative purposes, we look at two additional scenarios. One is $650 million. We know that that's the proposed settlement, and so we're showing with the same math that we're showing for all the other scenarios, like what that looks like on paper for firefighter compensation. And then we also used a $1.2 billion scenario. So where does that come from? As we've heard public commentary from the mayor, from city legal, and from HFD about this settlement, $1.2 billion was routinely thrown out there as the potential liability that the city could face. And so we ran that scenario as well to demonstrate what firefighter pay over that period would have had to be to reflect a $1.2 billion settlement. I'm going to repeat for the 10th time. These scenarios are not exhaustive. They're not intended to be. In fact, and I'll show you this at the end of the presentation, we created a website that we'll give you the address to at the end of this presentation, where you can go and not only see these 6 scenarios, but create your own scenarios and then see what that settlement value would be. So you can decide for yourself in the privacy of your desktop what's fair to you, and it'll tell you what the settlement value is for that set of raises on either a percentage basis or a dollar basis. Yes, council member.
And when you all of it will be based on base pay or pay per hour, but nothing will be included for incentives or any possible overtime. Is that correct?
So, so this looks at overall compensation for firefighters during that time period. And so, given that we know what overtime hours were in those years, you can solve for that as well. It also includes assumptions around pension contributions during those time periods. Now, I know that the way the settlement is structured, it's an overtime pay settlement for a number of reasons, but we look at overall pay and how much that would have been in these various scenarios. There are two things that are key to the current proposed settlement that are not in here at all. That's those special payments, and that's the legal fees.
What would the special payments be?
I think what's been discussed is in the realm of 5 to 10 million for this settlement. Again, we're not going into the complexities of that. I think that's ultimately a number that that you all are going to agree to, that from a magnitude perspective doesn't necessarily come close to the value of the larger settlement as a whole.
Okay, makes sense.
All right. Yes.
Thank you much. I really like the scenario 1, 2, and 3, particularly starting from just the consistent increase over time, right? And where we would put on par, and looking at scenario 2 with the $270 million settlement. That's something that we could do today, correct?
Well, you're jumping ahead on me,
I
Councilmember.
know I am, because I'm excited about it. And so, but when you get there, I really would like for you to tease out the comparison that we've been talking about in terms of our peer cities for scenario 2 and the way that you've illustrated that. And
Okay.
then on the dashboard that you're creating, is it an opportunity for us to layer with the incentives on this? Because this, based on what you're saying, it's a baseline just on overall compensation.
Sure. Again, scenario-wise, we can run any scenario that you want us to and give those figures back to you. Okay. I don't think it's going to be that impactful when we talk about $10 million in specials. Obviously, $10 million is a lot of money, but it'll be this number plus 10 million, right? And I think y'all are more than capable of doing that math. But we want to be as flexible and open as possible here. And so whatever scenarios you would like us to run, we're more than happy to do that. And that's the last bullet on the page. If you have other things in mind that are not covered here and not covered on the website that we share with you, run them by us. And we're happy to put those into the model and tell you what the model spits out. All right, so now jumping to scenario 1. As I described, this is looking at what salaries are on a per hour basis across our major city peer set and making HFD pay equal to them over the entire disputed period from fiscal year 2018 to 2024. If we were to go through that scenario, then we would reach our peer average in 2024 of $57,700 as our year 1 non-probationary starting salary. If we did that, starting salary today would be 11% higher than it is, which is almost $6,000, which I think is quite meaningful. Had we reached this type of compensation agreement with our firefighters, going from 2018 all the way to current day, that would have cost the city about $330 million over that time frame. When you tack on interest for those years, that gets you up to a calculated settlement value of roughly $380 million. To put it on a per firefighter basis, that's $85,000 to $95,000 per firefighter, and to annualize that over the 7-year disputed period, that's $12,000 to $14,000 per year per firefighter. Jumping to scenario 2, Councilmember Thomas. So what this does is this doesn't get you up to that blue line on day 1. This imagines a world in which we promised our firefighters back in 2017 that we're going to get you up to average over a number of years, and in fact gets them there in fiscal year 2024. Mathematically, that would have amounted to about a 4.1% annual raise. That's in your footnotes. But you see this smooth yellow curve and that area underneath it that says, hey, this would have cost a little bit more than what we paid them, and really a lot of bit more than what we paid them. So where does that get us? It gets us to the same ending salary of 2024 of $57,700. Again, 11% more than year one non-probationary firefighters are paid today. And how much would that have cost the city? $270 million over that time frame. When you tack on interest, we're talking about roughly $300 million. Per firefighter basis, $70,000 to $80,000 per firefighter. And again, if you annualize that, that's $10,000 to $11,000 per firefighter per disputed year within this impasse that we find ourselves in. Scenario 3. So this looks at the actual raises that HPD received in their collective bargaining agreement over this time period, and it gives those exact same percentage raises to our firefighters. As you can see, this is not as smooth of a curve. The average over this year that police officers received is a 3.5% annual raise. It wasn't 3.5% every single year. It was sometimes higher than that, sometimes lower than that, but that's where we averaged out. Had HFD gotten those same exact raises over this 7-year time frame, where they would end up is with a starting salary today of $55,300. That's roughly 7% or $3,500 more than the current HFD starting salary. And so you can see that what HPD received over this time is noticeably more than what HFD received. Had we, yes.
Can I jump in here? I'm used to just hitting the mic in my seat. So with scenario 3, and I'm really looking at the estimated the settlement portion, and when we look at our historically high fund balance, and when we look at our general fund, this is something that we could absorb today without absorbing additional debt for 30 years. Would that be accurate?
That would be an option that you would have.
Yeah, I mean, right, because for me, the tension and the upset is putting the city in a 30-plus year debt obligation, when if we have this scenario where we can, one, bring our firefighters up to scale, put them on track, right? Also acknowledge a settlement, pay them out, and because we have such a high fund balance, then that may put us in a position not to offer Houstonians fees and property tax increases, right? So I really like scenario 3, and I would like if your office can add to the language around the fund balance and the general fund as the mechanisms to pay for this versus bonding out.
Sure. So we can calculate that if we paid this in cash, next month, what that would do to fund balance. I'll tell you that in my role as watchdog and looking out for the fiscal sustainability of the city, we know that even before we consider this settlement, that we are facing a structural deficit going into next year, right? We're projecting north of $400 million, still a record fund balance for us. 260 brings us down to the $200 million range. And when we're thinking about a structural deficit of $160 to $200 million, which is what we're projecting even before HFD, then you see that we run out of money really quickly. And so it is an option. It is something that we can lay out for you. However, that would definitely increase the urgency of the other financial decisions that we would need to make to erase our structural deficit going forward. So I'll leave that there. It's an option. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the option that I would jump in with 2 feet, but it's worthy of consideration. Yes, Councilmember Pollard.
To follow up on Councilmember Thomas's point, she spoke about if we were to use the fund balance to pay the entire 260, but there could be advisement around using the fund balance to just pay for a portion. And we're just going off hypotheticals with
Sure.
scenario 3. Knowing that we do have other fiscal needs that have to be met outside of just this agreement in the years coming, but to be able to use a portion of the fund balance, since it is one of the highest in the city's history, if we were to use a scenario 3 hypothetical, and some advisement around what would a smart decision possibly be from a financial standpoint if we were to use the fund balance, what that may look like in dollars?
Sure. So I'm gonna step away from the scenarios for a second and answer the question more generally, because in either last meeting or the one previous to it, I've heard Councilmember Alcorn and perhaps others mention the idea of using some fund balance right now to pay off some portion of the settlement. Whatever cash you give away, today to try and take off a chunk of that settlement, it does take away from your long-term debt, certainly. It also takes away from the cushion that we have to deal with the structural deficit and those challenges that we have right now. And so while I would already say that the fiscal challenges that we have with the historic fund balances are urgent, that we have a year and a little bit of change to get within balance structurally, any, 10 million, 50 million, $100 million figure that we take away from the fund balance is going to make it even more urgent that we would have to right that ship and make the decisions that would get us to righting that ship. And so again, as we think about the structural deficit, and this is totally divorced from a conversation around this settlement, you either got to spend less or you have to increase revenue. And if we took away part of our fund balance, you got to figure that piece out much more quickly. Moving forward to scenario 4. This is very similar to the HPD scenario, except it provides the raises that Hope received, that other city employees received, instead of those that HPD received over this time frame. The raises that Hope received over the 7-year time frame were lower on average than those of HPD. HPD's, as you recall, averaged out to about 3.5%. Hope's averaged out to about 2.5%. And so you can see that shaded purple area is smaller than the shaded area that you saw in the previous slide. If you were to provide HFD with the raises, the exact same raises that Hope received over this time frame, where you would end up in this year, fiscal year 2024, is with a starting salary, again, which is year one non-probationary, of $51,500. As you can kind of see at the end of that slide on 2024, that number is actually slightly less than HFD's starting salary today. However, the fact that they got those raises over time steadily, you can see that there's, that purple shaded area is money that they would be owed, quote unquote, in this scenario. And so, again, had we gone through this scenario, had HFD firefighters received the same raises percentage-wise that Hope received over this entire time frame, it would have cost the city an additional $90 million in that time frame, which with interest would yield a settlement value of $110 million. On a per firefighter basis, that's $25,000 to $30,000. If you look at that annualized, that's $3,000 to $4,000 per firefighter per disputed year. So again, scenarios 5 and 6, these place a dollar amount on the settlement and then work backward to display to you what that would mean for individual firefighter salaries. And so if you look at the $650 million figure, what would we have had to pay firefighters over this 7-year time period such that the calculated value of the settlement with interest would equal $650 million. That's what you see in kind of this ugly green-brown shaded area here. What this looks like is that in 2018, firefighters would have received a 31% raise, and then they would get that same salary flat for a number of years up to 2024. As you can see, as it compares to that blue line, salaries would jump up higher than average salary across our major city peers early on, and then our peers would slowly catch up. So this results in a 2024 salary of $56,900, which is 10% higher than year one salary today for non-probationary firefighters. Had this scenario played out in real time, the city would have expended an additional $540 million over the time frame. And of course, given that it's a $650 million scenario, if you tack on interest, the total settlement value gets to $650 million. What does that represent? On a per firefighter basis, that's $155,000 to $165,000 per firefighter. And if you annualize that, that's $22,000 to $24,000 per firefighter per year. And then finally, let's look at the $1.2 billion scenario. This is the potential liability that that the mayor, that legal, and that the firefighters union have represented could have been out there. I think in the most recent meeting, I heard a term that was a number that was even higher than this, but we were already well into this analysis, so we're going to stick with $1.2 billion for this scenario. Similar to the $650 million scenario, what it shows is, big raise in year one and then flat payments from there. And so year one salary for a first year non-probationary firefighter would have jumped 53% in this scenario, up to $66,400. They would have received that same salary year over year until 2024. And that ending salary of $66,400 is 28% higher than starting salary today. The cost of this scenario would have been $1 billion over that time frame, $1.2 billion with interest. That totals $290,000 to $300,000 per firefighter, and $41,000 to $43,000 per firefighter per disputed year. And so, to summarize, I want to go back to the principle that I think we all agree with. If we want to attract and retain talent in any office within this city, but certainly with our first responders and our firefighters at the Houston Fire Department, our pay has to be competitive with those of our peers. Otherwise, they're going to not seek that job at all, or they're going to seek to go do that job somewhere else. I don't think there's any dispute on that fact. We also know that for years, firefighter compensation has not been competitive. They received no raises from the period of 17 to 21, and they received raises after that still represent a starting salary of more than 10% lower than their peers on a per hour basis. And so if we look, again, to summarize, at the going forward proposed collective bargaining agreement, that CBA and the pay scale that's within it, in a 2-year period by fiscal year 2026, we estimate that we would be on par with our peers on a per hour basis with a 10% raise and then an additional 6% raise. Going forward beyond that, if we continue to receive 6% raises and our peers on average continue to receive 3% raises, then of course we would end up with a higher starting salary on a per hour basis than our peers by the end of the proposed CBA. Looking at the proposed back pay settlement, again, in every scenario we ran, and this should not surprise you at all, it says the firefighters are owed something, right? I think, again, we all understand that. There's no dispute there. It's up to you all, members of City Council, to decide what's fair and what you'll agree to. The scenarios that we ran, which include the comparison to HOPE raises here in the city of Houston, the comparison to HPD raises here in the city of Houston, and a comparison to average peer starting salary, whether that's immediate starting in 2018 or over time reaching that parity in 2024. Those numbers range from a calculated $110 million settlement value up to a $380 million settlement value. For those backsolve scenarios of $650 million and $1.2 billion, those scenarios show what would be a higher average compensation for our firefighters throughout that time frame. I'll reiterate for the 11th time, these are not an exhaustive set of scenarios. We'll share our website in just a moment that will allow you to look at percentage raises over time that you can choose and dollar raises over time that you can choose. And then if what you're looking for isn't there, then we're happy to run additional scenarios for you, on a custom and ad hoc basis. And it shouldn't take very long to churn those out. Councilmember Pollard?
First, I want to thank you for your presentation. I think you laid everything out very, very well. I know you don't want to speak to a fairness argument, but from a feasible argument, on an outlook on what the city can afford based on the scenarios that you have run. Tell us your thoughts on how we as council members should be able to make informed decisions and be able to talk to the public about what these numbers mean from a pay standpoint, what we can afford.
Sure. So I got to be crystal clear. Before we give the firefighters an additional nickel, we're already upside down from a structural standpoint. And so what we can afford today is we cannot afford our current set of services that we provide to the city of Houston without either bringing down the cost of them or increasing revenues to reflect that cost. Our commitment from the controller's office is to offer ideas about how we can be more efficient, and also to evaluate options, not with a values lens, but just sharing the numbers of if you pursue this option, this is what that'll get you. And that's what we showed here today, right? And so again, before we even talk about firefighters, we're already looking at a deficit next year of projected $160 million to $200 million. Now, the proposed budget will be released very, very soon. And then I imagine y'all will tack on amendments, and then we'll have a budget. And that will tell us what the structural deficit truly is, with some assumptions around sales tax revenue and property tax revenue. But we'll continue to bang the drum that says we have to get our financial ship righted. And to do that, we have to do some combination of bringing down our costs or increasing revenue, and most likely some combination of both. So I don't see any additional questions from council members or staff, but before we move to potential press questions, are there any additional questions from council members or staff? There's a website. So again, for the 12th time, these scenarios are not exhaustive. If you visit this website behind me, hcontroller.com/fire, then you can see these scenarios again and read more detail. I know we moved through them with a bit of haste today, trying to be mindful of your time, but you can go and review these scenarios that we covered. You can also review additional scenarios that you choose for yourself and see the financial implications of those. hcontroller.com/fire, and we will seek to move that same content onto city websites as soon as possible and have it there for you. One more time, if you have additional scenarios that you'd like to look at, we're happy to run those for you and share those figures with you. Our commitment is to continue to work with you all, to continue to work with the mayor, city council, and other stakeholders to put the city of Houston on a pathway to fiscal sustainability, plain and simple. That's not an easy task, but my office is going to do its part to make sure that you all as policymakers are working with the same set of facts as one another. With budget deliberations approaching, that need grows more urgent by the day. And so let me close by thanking you all who joined us today. Councilmember Jackson, I see you were able to step in. So good to see you. By being here, each of us is demonstrating our commitment to increasing transparency in city government, and I believe that deserves recognition. I know that a number of other council members couldn't make it today, and so again, we are open and happy to make this same presentation to them personally and to share any details of it that might be asked. And so again, thank you, and I'll now be happy to take any questions from the media.
Thank you, Comptroller. Really quickly, so who are the peer cities you use to calculate the Texas average?
Austin, Fort Worth, Dallas, and San Antonio.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions for the controller?
All right. Thank y'all so much.